Let's bring in Doug Redeker, non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, to sort through the implications here. Doug, this has been one of the big questions in terms of potential next steps, the idea of an outright ban on Russia oil imports. Is that likely to be an effective move? Do you think it's a likely one?
Well, let's break down what that means. First of all, there's a U.S. ban on imports. There's an EU ban on imports. And then there's the U.S. and the EU, but primarily the U.S., actually imposing an oil export sanction on Russia in various grades of impact. If the U.S. simply imposes an import ban, that's a sort of a big deal, but it's not as big a deal on the global market because really the U.S. only imports a relatively small amount of oil from Russia. And if they're allowed to export elsewhere, then again, systemically, it's not a huge thing. That doesn't mean politically it wouldn't have a significance here, but it doesn't mean it's a systemic thing. If the EU comes along and does something similar, that's a big deal. Because although the U.S. and the EU are not the sum total of Russia's export market, combined, that is a big export market for Russia. That's going to have a big impact. But it's going to have a big impact on Europeans and Americans as well in their individual lives. That's why politicians have been very reluctant to go there. If we take that final step and we actually put a sanction on the export of oil from Russia, that means you're sanctioning their exports to anywhere in the world. And then you run into some questions about whether the Chinese would or would not abide by it. It's a bigger deal still. But in various levels, it's big, bigger, and biggest. And if we start going down that route, there's going to be a significant impact on Russia and a significant impact on oil prices.
Well, let's say it does not happen, at least not soon. It's only been a week since the existing sanctions were in place. Many companies taking it upon themselves also to cut ties. Is this, over time, do you think, going to have the intended effect of changing Putin's behavior?
This being oil sanctions or this being what we've done so far?
No, the sanctions that are already in place.
The sanctions that have already been put in place. Look, sanctions can play three different roles. They can be a deterrent. Well, that didn't happen because, of course, the war is happening, so it didn't deter the war. They can be punishment, which I would argue is primarily what's going on right now. Or they can be structured to be negotiating leverage, where you can turn the dial up or down depending on what your adversary, in this case Vladimir Putin, decides to do on the ground. I don't think that what we've done so far is really in that final category of negotiating leverage sanctions, because you're not going to say, well, we're going to give the oligarchs back some of their ill-gotten gains. We're not going to say that the Central Bank of Russia can intervene in the market a little bit, just not a lot. So a lot of the structures that have been put in place of these sanctions are really designed to punish. Is that going to deter further action from Vladimir Putin? We don't know. We haven't seen it so far. There's talk in Washington about the White House being a little concerned. We've backed him into a corner and he might react even worse. But I think these sanctions were necessary for political messaging, for actually, doing bad things to the bad guy. But whether they actually change the course of Vladimir Putin's thinking on his desire to change the regime and take over control of Ukraine, I'm not convinced.
One of the other options on that front is, of course, establishing a no-fly zone, something that the Ukrainian president has called for. NATO's ruled it out. There's some new results from a Reuters Ipsos poll in the U.S. 74% of U.S. adults say they support U.S. and NATO establishing no-fly zones to stop Russian airstrikes on Ukraine. Is that even possible to do?
Well, it's certainly possible to do, but as the White House has made very clear, what it means is putting U.S. and NATO forces in direct conflict in a military sense with Russia's forces. That's something that we have sought to avoid for, 75 years or so. It is not something that this White House, so the no-fly zone as a concept, who could oppose it? The Russians are committing atrocities, they're killing innocent people, and we have technical capacity to at least impede it, if not outright stop it. But by doing so, we risk, I don't like to use phrases that, at least as of about 10 days ago, were considered to be hyperbole. Things like World War III and nuclear. We use those as figurative concepts. You don't like to see them enter into the lexicon as literal concepts. So I think this White House is very careful about making sure that nuclear and World War III and things like that stay in the hyperbole and not in the literal. And if we were to engage in a no-fly zone kind of confrontation, the risks of getting that into the literal context go way higher than any leader in this country or Europe wants to see right now.